So this year has its fair share of important races that often get overlooked amid the 2024 speculation. Of course, we've got the governorships of Kentucky, Mississippi, and Louisiana up, but we also have the Virginia legislative elections as well as the Wisconsin Supreme Court race, which is actually in about a month. So there's definitely some important races, even if the really big ones are next year. And I want to spend today's video talking about Kentucky's governor's race, since I think it's probably the most interesting out of these three, especially since we've got a Democratic incumbent in one of the most red states in the entire country. So we're going to talk about the potential matchups here in Kentucky between Andy Beshear and a number of other Republican candidates, and what the likelihood is of the Republicans being able to flip this governorship, and obviously hold on to the other two, which we'll talk about in another video. So we'll take a deeper dive into Kentucky in just a sec, but before we do, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So as I mentioned, Kentucky is one of the reddest states in the nation. I believe this is a Trump plus 26 state as of 2020. Of course, in this gubernatorial race, you have Andy Beshear, the incumbent Democrat, who's got a lot of money on hand as of right now, $7.4 million, and he's been able to raise about $600,000. So on the Democratic side, Andy Beshear is going to be the nominee. You've got a couple of other, Pepe Martin, and of course, Jeff Young, who's sort of a perennial candidate, kind of a joke candidate. He lost even some blue parts of a congressional district around Lexington last cycle, but he's decided to run again, and he's running as sort of the tanky candidate, if you will, in this primary. He's not really going to go anywhere. Andy Beshear is going to be the nominee. I think the most speculation is on the Republican side, because we've got a lot of people declared to run against Andy Beshear. I think the most likely right off the bat to win the nomination is Daniel Cameron. He's the Attorney General of Kentucky. He's sort of been a rising star in GOP politics in the area. A lot of these other candidates aren't really as well known. You've got the Kentucky Commissioner of Agriculture. You got some high school teacher, Kelly Craft, a number of other people that I think ultimately aren't going to make it through the nominating process. I think Daniel Cameron at this point in time is going to be the Republican nominee, and probably has the best shot at actually beating Andy Beshear. He also has the most cash on hand of any of the candidates, although Kelly Craft seems to have been able to raise a lot of money on his own as well. In fact, over $500,000. But, you know, there's a decent amount of endorsements going around. Donald Trump has already endorsed Daniel Cameron for governor. Susan B. Anthony, which is a pro-life group, has endorsed Daniel Cameron. Kelly Craft has the endorsement of, a congressman in the area, a couple of state legislatures. But that's really it. I think most of the consolidated support is going to be around Daniel Cameron, especially because this is a race where Republicans really need to unite in order to defeat Andy Beshear, because he is an incumbent now. If we go back to 2019, Andy Beshear was able to win the governorship by a little more than 5,000 votes, a razor-thin margin. And it wasn't just running up the margins in the urban counties where he did exceptionally well in both Fayette and Jefferson County, but it was also massively cutting down the rural Republican margins in most of the state, especially in the eastern part of the state, which is historically very Democrat. This southern part of Kentucky, the reddest part here, is actually the most ancestrally Republican part of the state, and it's been Republican for well over a century. You can go back to even when Kentucky was voting very blue in some presidential races. This area is solidly Republican. So this is the area where Beshear did the worst, but pretty much everywhere else, he cut down Trump's margins back from 2016 pretty substantially, and just Republican margins across the board. He's able to win Campbell County by about 5 points. This is a county that back in 2016 went to Donald Trump by 24 points. So you've got these super red, super safe red counties that are going to Andy Beshear. Now, Andy Beshear, in and of himself, is a very strong candidate, mostly because his father was the former governor of the state. If we go back, not to 2015, but of course to 2011, Steve Beshear, who's a very popular incumbent governor, won re-election by over 20 points back in 2011, and of course in 2007, beat his Republican opponent by 17 points. If I'm not mistaken, I don't believe a single Republican governor in Kentucky has ever been reelected throughout its entire history. Of course, you can fact check me in the comments down below. But I'm pretty sure every Kentucky Republican governor has only been a one-term governor, either decided not to run for re-election or lost re-election. So Matt Bevin certainly had history against him when he was running for re-election in 2019, but it's very likely, in fact, it's almost certain he would have won had he just maintained a fairly average profile as a Republican governor. But of course, he had the ire of the teachers union. He was incredibly unpopular just across the board for a number of reasons. He was very tough on unions, which Kentucky does have sort of a union history in some areas. Again, this eastern part of the state that went to Beshear. And again, these were counties that Trump won in some cases by like 40, 50 percentage points that were going to Andy Beshear. So, you know, you had to be a really, really bad Republican to actually be able to lose these voters. But ultimately, Matt Bevin accomplished that, and now we have Andy Beshear as the incumbent. Now, incumbency does bring about its own advantage. People already know you, and Andy Beshear is a very popular governor. I'm pretty sure his approval rating last I checked was about 58%. He's over 20 points above water. You're not going to lose, quite frankly, if you go into an election with a 20 plus favorability rating, even in a state as red as Kentucky. In fact, Andy Beshear at that rate will probably outperform his 2019 numbers. Now, a similar case sort of happened in Kansas with Democratic Governor Laura Kelly, who I, of course, foolishly made a video saying that she was going to lose some months before the 2022 election. Now, my reasoning for that was the fact that Kansas was a very red state. 2022 was looking like it was going to be a red year, and I thought that at the end of the day, Laura Kelly would be dead on arrival. Now, it'd be a very close race, but I thought she was going to lose. I was wrong. In fact, she won by about 3 points. I think you could see a very similar situation with Andy Beshear in this case. And Kentucky has more of an ancestrally Democratic history than a place like Kansas. Kansas is one of the strongest states for the Republican Party throughout its entire history, whereas Kentucky has historically been more of a Democratic state, sort of part of the Solid South in the 19th and 20th century, and only recently sort of shifted over into being a more Republican state. So, you know, in its DNA, this is a state that still likes to elect sort of the moderate, more conservative Democrats. Now, Andy Beshear is not a real moderate or conservative Dem. In fact, he's very much just a generic Democrat who just has very good optics in the state. He has the name ID, and he is popular, and that's all that really matters, mostly probably because a lot of his policies haven't been passed in Kentucky due to the Republican legislature effectively blocking all of them. So, you know, Andy Beshear obviously has massive strength in the urban areas. Somebody like Daniel Cameron could pose a serious threat. Obviously, it's going to be a close race either way just because of the sheer partisanship of Kentucky, Kentucky being one of the reddest states in the country. But, you know, Daniel Cameron also shouldn't be underestimated. You know, he's somebody who, you know, on the exact same ballot, won by about 15 points. So he overperformed Bevin very considerably. But this shows you that a lot of Kentucky voters see Andy Beshear very differently than your run-of-the-mill Democrat. I mean, if we look at all these down-ballot races, Republicans did very well. Agricultural Commissioner winning by nearly 20 points. Obviously, as we mentioned before, Daniel Cameron winning by about 15. And one of the mistakes I made when analyzing the Kansas governor's race was that Dan Schmidt, who was the opponent of Laura Kelly, did the best out of all the down-ballot candidates back in 2018. I believe he got about 60% of the vote. Even though Laura Kelly beat Chris Kobach by about 5. So that was my mistake. Again, past elections aren't always indicators of future elections, and I think because Andy Beshear is an incumbent, it really changes the name of the game. I wouldn't be surprised if Beshear does worse in some of these rural counties, but I think he's going to do significantly better in places like Fayette County and Jefferson, and these are areas where the Republicans are really going to have to try and get their voters out to support Cameron. So ultimately, as I see it today, I actually think Kentucky's race is leaning in favor of Andy Beshear. I think if I had to bet now, he'd probably win by about 2 to 3, maybe even 4 percentage points just because of the fact that he is such a popular governor at the moment. Now, a lot of things can change. You know, we've still got many months before the general election, but as of right now, Andy Beshear, and again, polls don't really mean a whole lot this early on, but the only polls we have to go off of, he's winning pretty comfortably. Now, of course, you could attribute that partially to the fact that he's the incumbent. People know who he is. Of course, it's also Mason Dixon, so they don't always have the best track record. But, you know, Beshear is leading all these Republicans quite considerably. He's leading Mark Harmon by 20 points, 57 to 32 against Kelly Craft. Daniel Cameron's the only one who gets it within 10 points, and even then he's still losing by 9. So, again, I wouldn't put so much stake in these early polls, but they sort of give us an indicator of where voters are leading. Their default position is to support Beshear because he is the incumbent, but there certainly could be a Republican upset in this state. And this really just goes to show you the broader trend that governor's races are very different than federal races. And I do want to talk about in a future video sort of the New England phenomenon where you have these New England governors. And I did make a video like 2 years back or so talking about that. But, you know, you have states where people are able to differentiate between who's in the governor's mansion and who they send to Washington. And Kentucky is certainly one of those states. Again, historically, this state, by and large, has mostly had Democratic governors. And, you know, a Republican governor is a rarity. A Republican governor beating a Democratic incumbent is certainly even more rare. So obviously we'll wait to see what happens. But I think as of right now, Beshear certainly has an edge, even against Cameron, who might be a strong candidate. He is an incumbent. He has a lot of money. And the Beshear name still carries a lot of weight in Kentucky. So anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Hit the bell notification so we don't miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.